Morning, everyone. This is Aubrey Davis from the United States Air Force Academy, and we're very, very happy to welcome back Dr. Evie Kendal. Uh, Dr. Kendal is a bioethicist and public health scientist specializing in the ethics of emerging technologies. Her work focuses on reproductive biotechnologies, health communication and media, and space ethics. Evie is a senior lecturer of health promotion at Swinburne University of Technology's Department of Health Sciences and Biostatistics and heads the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications of Emerging Technologies LSIT Research Group housed at the Iverson Health Innovation Research Institute. Dr. Kendall today is going to be talking about some of her current research that she's been working on. And so we're very happy, Dr. Kendall, to welcome you back to our webinar. And with that, we will hand it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the invitation. So today I'll be talking about the ethics of asteroid mining and particularly some environmental accounting intersections. So this is based on a recent publication for the AAAJ journal. So before we can talk about asteroid mining, we do need to look at the terrestrial analog of mining on Earth. So what are the ethical issues with terrestrial mining? The fairly obvious one that comes to mind first is, of course, environmental damage. So the last decade of emissions research has really demonstrated that fossil fuels are responsible for the current climate crisis. And yet terrestrial mining operations continue to expand every year. So between 2020 and this year, it was estimated that fossil fuel companies would invest a further 1.4 trillion US dollars globally in new projects. So this is things that above what already existed in 2020. So another major concern is, of course, the health implications for workers, so people in mines and communities who live near mines, because, of course, there's particulate matter that might be inhaled. There's a number of carcinogens that people might be exposed to. So working in a mine or being in the vicinity of a mine can actually be very damaging to your health. We also, of course, have the concentration of extreme wealth in the hands of very few people. And in many cases, this also entails tax avoidance and the violation of what we call the social contract. So many of you will be familiar, of course, the social contract refers to the fact that if you want to live in a society and benefit from living in that society, you also have to agree to play by the rules. So a good example of how that works is you pay tax in order to benefit from certain social supports. So if you want to have access to a hospital, for example, most people cannot possibly hope to afford to build a hospital themselves. They can't afford to staff it or train people all by themselves. So we pay taxes and the state then provides those services ideally. And if you want to access those services, the expectation is that you're contributing to that collective good. You're paying taxes so that you can get healthcare. So the issue with violating the social contract in mining is, of course, public money is often being used to subsidize private profit. So instead of sharing communal resources and sort of playing by those social rules, we find that a few individuals get very rich and a lot of other people suffer these health implications and, of course, the effects of environmental damage. Further public money is then also used to clean up this environmental and health damage. So it's not the mining corporations that are often paying for this, it's the public. So how does this happen? We find that lobbyists actually control policy. So we're in a situation sometimes described as regulatory capture. So a definition for regulatory capture, we have Carter and McKenzie. They define it as when industry actors have preferential access to government decision-making and regulatory authorities. Governance decisions are based not on the public interest, but rather on industry priorities. So that, of course, means that the decisions that are made are not necessarily in the public's best interest, they're in the interests of people hoping to profit. So how do these subsidies actually work for terrestrial mining? Because this will be relevant for how we want to avoid systems with asteroid mining repeating the same mistakes that we have here. So we have John A. Bogdansky saying that the treatment of fossil fuel industries in the American federal income taxation system, as an example, are highly favourable to those industries from a tax theoretician's standpoint, embarrassingly so, including through wildly lenient rules regarding if, how, and when profits are calculated for tax purposes. Now, one of the ways that works is it artificially reduces the cost of fuel and therefore increases its use. So the main way that terrestrial mining is artificially reduced in cost is by failing to make fossil fuel companies liable for the environmental and health damage they cause. So if they had to factor in into the cost of doing business, all of those health and environmental costs, the numbers would be very, very different. So again, this is artificially sort of inflating the carbon bubble and overvaluing fossil fuel company assets. So it doesn't take into account the true cost of doing that business. So the carbon bubble is referring to portfolios connected to fossil fuels, and these are estimated to be worth about $4 trillion. So if these sort of portfolios suddenly went bust, if the carbon bubble burst, as we say, it could cause global economic catastrophe. Now, this is an ethical issue in and of itself. So you don't necessarily have to agree with how these people made this money, whether or not you agree with investment in fossil fuel companies, even recognizing that a lot of people don't know that their investments are actually partially in fossil fuel companies. You'll find that if we have this economic catastrophe, we have a global recession, this will cause a lot of pain and suffering for a lot of people. So a lot of families would suffer under those conditions. And a lot of people, as I said, may not actually know that some of their money is dependent on this artificially inflated sort of assets of fossil fuel companies. So we see here, of course, that this is representing our $4 trillion worth of fossil fuel portfolios in terms of investment. So we also have this quote by Benjamin K. Sovacool: if the world's potential $1.9 trillion in energy subsidies were repealed tomorrow, that would provide enough money to eliminate worldwide hunger and malnutrition 100 times over. Now, obviously, in reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. But if we just looked at those numbers, if we were taking this from a utilitarian standpoint, so the greatest good for the greatest number, that classical ethical sort of method of deciding what's right and wrong, it would be very clear here that subsidizing an already very bloated industry, a very rich few elite, is not in the global best interest. So it's not doing the most good that it could possibly do. So this is an interesting thing to keep in mind, of course. So again, our concerns are, how does this actually happen? Again, we have lobbyists who are actually controlling a lot of these decisions. And one of those major decisions that's being controlled is whether or not these subsidies continue. Once we have subsidies given to companies that will actually reduce the cost of them doing business and increase their profits, no matter how those subsidies are done, it's very, very difficult to take them away. So if we are thinking, how can we have an ethical asteroid mining system set up? It's really important to remember that these subsidies that we are currently captured by, we've got that regulatory capture, very difficult to take away these subsidies. These don't exist outside of Earth. So any asteroid mining system that we decide to develop, we can consciously avoid repeating these mistakes. So again, the subsidies don't need to be repealed if we don't award them in the first place, which is why it's important to have these kinds of discussions in advance of having this sector actually blow up. So what do we do on Earth regarding this issue of business not actually paying the true costs of its system? So ethics and environmental accounting, essentially. So here is an article by Matthew Brander claiming there should be more normative research, so ethical research about right and wrong, on how social and environmental accounting should be done. So essentially, Brander discusses a case where the Scottish government reached out and called for these normative recommendations on what they should or could do regarding environmental accounting. So taking into account the effects on the environment of doing certain business. So that's an important thing to think about. They asked for these recommendations. People are looking for some system to develop what is right and wrong, what should we do. But what we see from this article is there was an apparent absence of normativity, or more specifically, the normative development of accounting methods within that social and environmental accounting research that proposes in detail how accounting for climate change should be done, not necessarily how it is currently done, but how it should be done. So that's an ethical argument there. They found not just that no SEA research literature was identified in the synthesis report for answering these questions, but that almost no immediately relevant academic literature was found at all, indicating a sizable gap in current academic practice. So that is quite interesting when you think about what are we actually doing in terms of best practice, best ethical practice regarding this particular industry. And again, it is a massive industry. So if we don't even know how to do this properly on Earth, what hope do we have for space? So let's take it to the asteroid mining context here. So the questions that I want people to consider, and we're not answering these questions, we're just asking these questions. How do we avoid regulatory capture for asteroid mining? So again, we don't have systems in place at present. No one is actually doing this right now. And the question of whether we will or will not be able to do it, sort of practically, is kind of to the side here, because we're interested in what is the ethical way of doing this rather than what's the technical feasibility for this. So how do we mitigate environmental and health damage? And again, this is not just for mining activities that we have on Earth right now, but also the ones that we might be doing in space, but also focusing on the fact that if the goal of asteroid mining is actually to return resources to Earth, then we don't just need to focus on what is the potential damage for the mining activity in space, but also where we will use the future resources. So if we are actually bringing them back to Earth, and again, we're putting the technical challenges aside for a moment there, if we're going to take the resources and use them here, we need to factor in that the use of the resources is actually often bad for the environment as well. How do we avoid the creation of asteroid mining magnates? How do we tax asteroid mining assets? So we don't really want to have a situation where someone can be a multi-trillionaire because they own a lot of resources in space and they're not paying their way on Earth. And then a classical problem, how do we resolve the potential conflicts regarding commercial use of space assets with the non-appropriation clause of the Outer Space Treaty? That treaty is, of course, still incredibly influential when it comes to space ethics. It's one that many, many spacefaring nations have agreed to, and it really is a powerful symbol of collaboration. So we don't want something to be undermining that collaboration. So when we look at the asteroid mining feasibility, as I said, for the most part, we're leaving the technical elements to the side, but we are still quite interested in how is this going to work in terms of the environmental accounting and the ethics. So in the article, Asteroid Mining, Integrity and Containment, Tony Milligan wrote that there is every reason to believe that at some point in the not too distant future, decades rather than centuries, serious attempts will be made to mine asteroids. So this article was written almost a decade ago, but it is still one of the very few academic papers that's specifically concerned with the ethics of asteroid mining. So even though it's a decade old, we find that it was quite popular and quite influential both at that time and still today. And the reason 2015 was very important, of course, was that was around the time that Luxembourg and the United States were in the process of issuing private asteroid mining licenses. So this was quite unusual at the time because there was often an interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty believed to sort of disagree with the validity of a commercial operation in space. But these two countries sort of bucked that trend. And now the issuing of private mining licenses is really catching on globally. So many other countries are either regulating it now or they're in the process of developing regulation for that sort of private interest in asteroid mining or sometimes lunar mining, of course. So some of the countries that are interested in that right now, that are negotiating these differences, are China, Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and India, just to name a few. So there was, back in 2015, this idea that we were going to have this massive asteroid mining boom. That did not come to pass in the last decade, of course. There's still significant interest in this future potential, but of course, many barriers were identified, and this is why we haven't actually seen any asteroid mining operations really kicking off. So access to space might be getting more accessible for smaller corporations, but the idea of asteroid mining still has the major obstacle to overcome of transportation. So both to the asteroid, they assure me they are not close, at least most of the useful ones that we might want to mine are not close to us, but also transportation of the resources that are mined. So trying to get the resources back to Earth, many people believe is actually not feasible. So the discussion becomes, can we use asteroid mining or lunar mining in order to support an off-world settlement instead? So for the purpose of this discussion, we will assume that the feasibility is present, that we are able to asteroid mine in the future, and we'll be looking at how could we do so ethically. So first of all, we need to establish, are there any actual ethical benefits to asteroid mining? So in the same collection of articles, and you can see the image on the screen here, that Milligan's piece was published in, there's one by Daniel Pilchman who appeals to a more utilitarian perspective in favour of supporting this potential new industry, so a new form of energy sector. So Milligan takes a virtue ethics stance, focusing on what our methods of asteroid mining might say for us as a society or even as a species, whereas Pilchman focuses on the wealth that could be generated and the positive outcomes for people that we could see through the generation of that wealth. And we can see the quote on the screen now: asteroid mining is poised to deliver massive benefits to humankind in the form of cheaper fuels and valuable materials without forcing humans to bear the costs of environmental degradation that have hitherto been part and parcel with resource extraction. On its face, at least, asteroid mining will be good for people. That's Pilchman's claim there. So we have to ask, does it really cause less environmental damage on Earth? If all we do is take resources back, particularly carbon-intensive resources, and we burn them on Earth, obviously that's not really helping the problem. That's still doing damage to the climate. But you might even say it's still doing less damage than if we were pulling those resources out of the ground here. So even if we have one side of that balance still occurring, the other side is not. So that's still potentially a compelling argument for less environmental damage. But then, of course, as mentioned before, we could just be looking at supplying an off-world community, in which case, of course, if the alternative was doing more mining on Earth to supply resources to that off-world community, obviously finding a more local source is going to be better for everyone there. So here we have, it's not as compelling if you are just going to be taking things out of the ground here or burning them here, but it can be quite important if we are going to mitigate or avoid entirely some of that environmental damage. So accurate carbon accounting here is actually very important on both sides of that equation. So we also have Pilchman talking a bit about the ethical risks of asteroid mining, because some of the benefits that he previously talked about, of course, these greater good for great numbers of people, actually depend on us sharing the spoils of this off-world mining. So he states, unregulated asteroid mining would exacerbate already problematic levels of economic inequality. Asteroid mining represents the possibility of expanding one's own wealth significantly, but this possibility is only available to those who are already extremely wealthy. Without regulation like taxes on mining operations to pay for public services that improve the lot of the worst off in society, the practice of asteroid mining threatens to further concentrate wealth in the hands of the very few. And again, we've seen that analogue. Our terrestrial mining example does tell us we have damage being done to communities and extreme wealth being concentrated in the hands of just a few. So everyone is suffering the effects of mining that are negative, but not everyone is getting the benefits. So those positives that were previously mentioned by Pilchman here. So really important considerations. Do we need to consider harm to the space environment? And when we're talking about asteroids, a lot of people consider those to be not as important as something like the moon. The moon is very important to us. It has a lot of romantic symbolism for us. It has practical uses for us. And of course, we've got the heritage, we've got the Apollo missions, we've got the signs of human activity in space that are actually present on the moon. So when people say we shouldn't engage in lunar mining, often it's because it will damage that heritage that they want to share and leave for future generations. You may think that an asteroid is quite similar, that perhaps we should leave it alone, leave it for future generations to also enjoy in whatever way one might decide an asteroid can be enjoyed. Perhaps it's just the knowledge that it's out there, happily being an asteroid. We're also concerned, of course, with the harm to space workers. So if we're concerned about the health implications of working in a mine on Earth, how much more so in the hostile environment of space? So concerns include that we have people who are already at very high risk of fatality. We have an environment that's already very hostile to human survival. And of course, being in a mining facility then exacerbates that health risk again. So particularly if these resources are going to be used either on Earth or in an off-world community that's separate to the mining facility, we might have an argument that the risks are being borne by one population while the benefits are conferred elsewhere. And classically, that's a justice issue. So we would say that some people are being exploited for the benefit of others, and that brings a separate sort of ethical dimension there. Here we have the example that many of you will be familiar with. This is the Psyche 16 asteroid, which people are very excited about because it is variably reported to be worth between 10 and 700 quintillion dollars. Obviously, that is working on the assumption that you could get there, mine it completely, transport all those metals back, and actually sell them at current Earth metal prices, all of which, of course, incredibly unlikely. But if you could, that would be the equivalent of $1.2 billion per person on Earth if we were to share it equally. Now, I don't think anyone thinks human beings are going to share the spoils of the Psyche 16 asteroid equally across the whole population. I think that's perhaps a little too optimistic. But the reality is, it is worth more than the entire global economy. So this introduces yet another ethical concern, which is asteroid mining actually has the potential to flood the terrestrial metals market in such a way that it collapses all of the portfolios connected to that sector. So you may not care if someone's investment portfolio collapses. That is something I'm also sympathetic to. But if we want to think about human suffering that's associated with like a global recession, we would need to consider how carefully we could introduce resources that were mined off-world into our global economy. So we don't actually want to see everyone suffering a global recession. But it is interesting to think that some of these resources are available in such massive quantities in these asteroids that there's more in them than all of that particular metal found on Earth combined. So it really does have the potential to be quite disruptive in terms of accounting. So let's look at who's going to own these asteroids and these resources. So we have a variety of different concerns regarding asteroid mining or lunar mining. And one of them, of course, relates to the Outer Space Treaty. So Del Real et al. In 2020 stated that according to the OST, countries are not allowed to claim sovereignty over any space body. If, for instance, a country plants a flag on an asteroid or a planet, it could not declare it as its property. There is something missing in the OST, however, since it does not specify anything regarding mineral resources that could be found in celestial bodies. So the legal scholar Brian M. Hofstadt claims the OST's appeal to the province of all mankind is typically believed to derive from the ancient Roman idea of res communis. So this is the right to free access and use but not rights of ownership to the shared property of the community. So these are the commons, so the space commons, so to say. So just like in our hospital example, if you use a hospital, you don't own it. You're not allowed to possess it in a way that would stop other people from using it. According to our social contract, you're paying into the system so that you can use it, but you don't get to keep it. And you certainly don't get to prevent other people from accessing this common good. And it's like a public park. You can use it, but you don't get to stop other people from accessing it, and you don't get to take any of it home with you. So if we use another health example, it's quite useful to think of the difference between owning something and using something. In my country, in Australia, it is illegal to trade in any body tissues. So we cannot buy or sell blood, for example. But when we're doing medical research, we can often reimburse participants because they come into a study and they might be donating blood to that medical study. So we reimburse them for the inconvenience and the time that it takes to come and donate their blood for our medical research. But at no point are we allowed to say that we are buying their blood, because that's a crime. So we're not buying or selling blood, but we're simply paying to be able to collect and use it. So you might say that's just semantics. And the question then becomes, is there a meaningful difference between appropriating something like a celestial object or just using it to mine its resources? So some people say they're the same. Others say there's a meaningful difference, that you could mine something without owning it. So the OST doesn't address the difference between asteroid mining and, say, appropriating a celestial body, because that wasn't even a consideration back in 1967. The 1979 Moon Agreement does explicitly ban lunar mining, but it garnered few signatories, and some have actually started recently to withdraw support from that agreement, partly because of this commercial interest in mining. The implications and specific wording of the Artemis Accords regarding space resource extraction are still being worked out in space law discussions. It will be very interesting to see how those issues are settled once it becomes feasible to actually engage in a large-scale mining operation off-world, if that ever actually becomes the case. So we don't know exactly how these issues are going to be settled legally, and whether it is a violation of the OST to mine an asteroid or obviously to engage in lunar mining. We'll see how that plays out over the next couple of decades. If we're looking at our ethics of asteroid mining, we want to make sure, again, we're not repeating the mistakes of terrestrial mining. We want to make sure we minimize environmental damage to the Earth and obviously off-world. Now, we need to protect the health and safety of our miners as well. Space mining will involve significant vulnerability. So Charles S. Cockle actually has this wonderful article that talks about space being tyranny prone because of its distance from Earth-based regulatory bodies and because of the harsh environment of space itself. So imagine that you're a miner in a lunar facility and you've decided that you're sick of working 28 hours in a row, you're sick of doing that, and you want better working conditions. But your boss quite literally owns the air that you breathe. So your ability to negotiate for better conditions is, of course, severely limited in that environment. So this is what that tyranny-prone statement actually means. Too far away from regulatory bodies for any of Earth-based systems to be really enforceable in a practical way, but also very vulnerable because everything you need to survive is being artificially supplied. And that will probably be from whoever owns the mining facility. So that puts you at a great disadvantage relative to the power of your employer. So this is a real issue. When we look at that environmental damage off-world, we're not only concerned with the safety of the miners who might be living in an off-world facility, but also whether or not the space environment should be left as it is for other reasons. So that might be for reasons of heritage, as we've noted. But also, if you're a deontologist, so you're less concerned with the consequences of actions, you're less concerned with the virtues of the people acting, and you actually focus more on intrinsic values and duties, you might say that an asteroid has a right to be left alone, or that the moon has a right to be left alone. So some people do consider the rights or potential rights of these celestial bodies as well. So they think there's an intrinsic sort of right to respect that mining would potentially violate. We are potentially in a situation right now where we can prevent subsidies and regulatory capture from the outset. Asteroid mining does not currently exist. We do not currently have strong lobbyists who are agitating for tax avoidance strategies, etc. So this is the time where we can have these conversations and actually make sure that we avoid these situations in the future. We could try to use the wealth generated to benefit the many and not just the elite. So this is a way of distributing the sort of spoils of asteroid mining in a way that's more fair than the current mining situations on Earth, where again, lots of people suffer, lots of people work really hard, very few people actually get extremely wealthy from this activity. But the other thing we might want to consider is how we can avoid flooding the terrestrial market with space resources to prevent that sort of radical bursting of the carbon bubble. Many argue that we obviously need to decarbonize, we need to avoid all these investments, we need to divest from fossil fuel companies, but very few people are sort of advocating for doing it overnight. So something that is more gradual, more conscious, more thought through is probably going to be more beneficial globally, making sure that people actually have a chance to sort of protect their living, protect their ability to feed their family, not have a drastic change in economic conditions globally. So that might involve something like making sure that those very sort of expensive metals here are used in space for what they're needed for. They're used off-world, where they won't have the same sort of market that they have here. So you might even argue that because these resources are found in space and they're found by people working in space, that we should prioritize them for the space-dwelling communities. So instead of saying we're going to let people mine these resources and bring them back to Earth, where they're going to get, those market prices that make them very wealthy, perhaps we have to use them in space to support the space communities. And this will help us avoid that tax haven in space situation. So you can agree or disagree with these suggestions. They're just mirrored on the terrestrial mining analogue. So what have we done wrong in the past that's causing problems now? And how can we avoid that in a new sector? So the final thing to consider is if we're going to have an asteroid mining sector, how do we actually secure the social license to operate that system? We know that terrestrial mining is currently suffering a loss to its legitimacy. A lot of people are divesting from fossil fuel companies. They are losing social license because of the very visible effects of climate change and the role that fossil fuels have played in that current situation. So one major way that we can secure a social license for asteroid mining is focusing on the contribution it could make to the green energy transition. So some really important substances required for us to have cleaner energy are things like cobalt that can be found in very large quantities in some asteroids, but have very limited sources on Earth. And some of those sources can be quite politically challenging as well. So making sure that our asteroid mining companies are actually abiding by the rules of the social contract. So that has a lot to do with how the resources are distributed. And of course, paying into the system like a taxation system, whether that be an off-world system or using our existing taxation systems on Earth to make sure that someone isn't sort of attracting a great deal of wealth off-world and avoiding paying back into society. So the commitment to environmental sustainability will have to be front and center. So because of the association with terrestrial mining and all the potential damage that's doing, anything that's suggesting a new form of mining, if it wants to receive its social license, it will need to commit to environmental sustainability. So there's sections that are sort of relevant there are getting into space in the first place, engaging the mining operation itself, like how is that going to be done as safely and sustainably as possible, the use of the resources, the transportation of the resources, all of the whole chain will have to be sustainable. So borrowing from the CSIRO, which is Australia's peak national science agency, their social licensing for terrestrial mining infographic on the screen here, we see that as long as we have these key elements, so procedural fairness, which means that different people are treated fairly across the system. Not everyone's getting the same thing. Not everyone's going to directly benefit from asteroid mining, for example. But we can make sure that it's not something that's just making very few people ludicrously wealthy and disadvantaging others by comparison. We then look at our distributional fairness, so that's non-discriminatory allocation of resources. So I would like it if we shared the resources fairly across the whole global community. Hopefully there is some way we can do that. And governance capacity, so the regulation being for the public good, not for commercial interests. This is what's necessary to build trust in the mining industry and therefore acceptance, so the social license for the mining. So that's what's currently suggested for on Earth, and I think this model can be applied to asteroid mining as well. So how are we going to engage all of those elements of fairness? People are treated fairly, resources are distributed fairly, and we are not in a situation of regulatory capture. We build trust, we actually build legitimacy, so moral and procedural legitimacy, in order to get the acceptance of the community for our potential mining project. So that is all that I have to say at this point. So I say thank you very much for listening. I hope there's some questions. This is the list of resources from the quotes, and obviously there's further reading in the article itself that I'm presenting on, but these are just the resources that have been cited directly in this talk. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kendal, so much for this incredible deep dive. So many things to think about in wonderful in-depth research. So we always love having you talk because everything is incredibly well backed up, and so thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. I've already put links in the chat so that folks can feel free to interact. Essentially any way you want. Raise your hand. We're very open here. But I'll maybe start off the questions because I have obviously a couple of pages of notes here that I've taken. An incredibly interesting presentation. One of the things that sort of came to mind, sort of throughout the presentation, was this idea of perhaps timing. And I love the thought of, okay, using the allegory of terrestrial mining, what lessons can we learn from it and apply it to outer space and kind of avoid a lot of those pitfalls, which are many. And one that always comes to mind to me is sort of from my home state, Minnesota, in the northern area, where they're trying to extract a lot of battery-based components, some not even so much rare earths, but even copper and other kinds of things. And one of the things that they have discovered in that is that in a heavily lake-based environment, some of the environmental consequences that you would normally not necessarily see are almost exacerbated or even accelerated. But at the same time, folks are saying, well, if we're going to go ahead and have an impact on things like climate change, then we need to build more batteries and have more power storage. So how does one reconcile that? As we go through, and do we need to maybe consider it from the perspective of maybe an arc? Like, okay, we know that much like the kind of the industrial era, we have to invest a lot. We're going to spend a lot of carbon. We know that we're going to have really big mistakes that we're going to make, but is it worth it? In the end, kind of thinking about your social contract, but be very interested in your thoughts on that, Dr. K.
Yeah. And I mean, the balance sheet is really hard for that, because obviously the things that we're trying to do to fix the problem long term do actually have these short term pitfalls as well. So things like we need better batteries, but of course, making those better batteries is also contributing to climate change. So yeah, that's a real challenge. And the other dimensions that come into that, of course, are people who are currently working in fossil fuels. Obviously, we need to make sure we have a job transition program to sort of align with our energy transition program, because otherwise we're making life better for some people and much worse for others. So what we actually want is to make things better for everyone. So that requires that not only do we step away from some of those industries that are very harmful to the environment, but that we take people with us. So finding sort of energy transition and workplace transition at the same time. So sort of getting people into the greener energy is a fairly obvious way. But things like building batteries, they're very different skills to mining iron, for example. So we need some upskilling programs. We need a lot of support for people to make sure that we're not leaving people behind when we're trying to engage in this sort of clean energy movement. So yeah, I mean, that's just another thing that sort of comes to mind there. But is it worth it? I mean, hopefully, if I could go back in time and influence policy such that we never started digging things out of the ground in the first place, obviously I would. But at the moment, of course, we've got this situation where there is a lot of damage, but there's also a global equity issue as well. So there's Chinese researchers, Pan et al., who state there's a global equity issue when it comes to space resource extraction as well, because only the technologically advanced and more wealthy countries are going to be able to access that resource, at least in the sort of medium term. And by the time other countries have access, there won't be as much left, or perhaps it will be much more difficult to get. So there's going to be an imbalance in the benefits that are attracted. So they were arguing that we should distribute those benefits fairly. And obviously, people draw analogies to sort of deep sea mining and having protection zones where we have to leave as good for others later as what we're taking now. So that's another sort of consideration to go with that. But also, a lot of developing countries have made the very compelling argument that it's very expensive to decarbonize and to transition to green energy. And it's much more difficult for them to afford those costs when they're suffering the effects of climate change that was caused by wealthier countries and their industrial activities, who are now then expecting them to sort of contribute less carbon emissions, etc., and spending more in order to do that, when that cheap energy and dirty energy really benefited some of these other industrial countries at the expense of those who are then contributing sort of more of that now. So again, there's an equity issue globally and generationally that we need to consider as well.
No, absolutely, and thank you for that for that response. It's very interesting. As we think about worker safety, something that always seems to come up is not necessarily mining with a large group of people that are doing this off world. And again, I think environmental arguments are kind of abound. Like, hey, look, we can mine these materials off world and have no real impact except for the launch, the launch platforms and things like that. And so, trade space there is fairly attractive. But then also worker safety with Android development or robotics development seems to be something that is very attractive to private investment. And would be interesting because I know you published this in an economics paper. I mean, what would your thoughts be like on the trade space economically for a large, maybe even government investment in robotics development, and then having that sort of be the vanguard for future sort of off-world mining in that space.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess that comes down to, those arguments regarding why should we use robots or AI? And people say for the dull, the dirty, the dangerous. And some people add the dear, so things that are really expensive to do otherwise. So the kind of jobs that are dangerous and dirty are the kind of ones that we want to outsource to machinery. And I think that's quite compelling. But in the short term, of course, it's very expensive to develop that technology. So one of the issues with asteroid mining, of course, is it's not currently possible. So people would need to be investing in these technologies either because they have other uses that they're going to benefit from anyway, or they're going to risk it developing an asteroid mining bot, for example, that they may never get to use. So it's very difficult to justify that kind of R&D expenditure without a guaranteed sort of outlet to make money. But I think it definitely does speak to that appropriate use of technology to remove the dull, dirty, and dangerous from humans' lives.
Yeah, and that's interesting because the initial investment, talking kind of about that economics balance, is like, okay, if you're being able to mine one thing that can essentially debase an entire global economy,
Yeah.
how does one reconcile that? I mean, how does one do that? I mean, if you've got a private company that can ostensibly make that possible, how does that even work? How do you
Yeah.
do you keep the market from being flooded? Is that regulatory
Yeah,
or another?
I would say it's regulatory, but that it has to be done in advance of the technology actually making it feasible to do this. Because once people can access these resources, if there's nothing stopping them from flooding the market, then that's what they're going to do. Um, that's the capitalist drive, and everyone is essentially worse off, other than perhaps one or two very wealthy asteroid mining magnates. And of course, that's also temporary, because once you've flooded that market, of course, the value is going to deteriorate as well. So we've got this issue where perhaps we need to cap the amount of, say, a rare earth metal that can be introduced that's from an off-world mining facility, and perhaps keep the majority of those resources for use in space communities, where they will, of course, have a completely different value system. So when its survival is already so difficult and so expensive, those kind of resources are going to be used, they're going to be valued according to their ability to support human survival off world. So you'll find things like water are going to be more valuable than any of these sort of precious metals. So I think very conscious planning is what's needed, because once the cat's out of the bag, so to speak, it's very difficult to then impose restrictions or caps or taxes, etc. And as we've seen, if you decide to go down the subsidy route, it's very difficult to then take the subsidy away in the future. So even things like emissions trading schemes, etc., we're in a situation where governments are having to compensate companies for getting them to reduce emissions when they gave them licenses for free. So in order to undo that licensing, governments are now reimbursing companies for something that was free in the first place, from the perspective of that company. So this is something that's obviously very problematic in terms of environmental accounting, in terms of ethics. If we are in a situation where the private companies are getting compensated both for and for not engaging in climate damaging industrial processes.
No, yeah, absolutely, and that leads to kind of another thought. You know, we're looking at the regulatory space here. You know, what we've had some recent Supreme Court movement with regard to a case called Chevron, which was the Chevron deference was something that the Supreme Court used to almost automatically give to an agency in interpreting their own statute. If the statute was ambiguous or otherwise unclear, they would defer to the agency's expertise. And so when you're dealing with the regulatory space, even 10 years ago, it would have been a much different story to say, hey, if we have a regulator and say, for example, a company were able to announce, like tomorrow, they're able to launch and they're able to do some lunar mining or whatever the case might be, who would regulate the darn thing? And right now with the current Supreme Court, they're ostensibly saying to Congress that you must speak clearly. You have to go ahead and clearly state that, the FCC or, the FTC or whomever is the regulatory body, at least in the United States perspective, for doing that. Is that a corollary in Australia and in a global trend that you're seeing, or are you seeing some differentiation there?
um, I think it's like, my perspective is the Australian sort of legal system has another level of sort of like common sense reading that happens before a lot of things get deliberated. So cases might be thrown out for being frivolous at that stage. But also the idea is like, if this is the common person's interpretation of this, that actually does hold quite a bit of weight. So it's like intention sort of comes into that a lot. But I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really speak directly to the ambiguities of language there, in terms of like how would we come down on those kind of decisions. But it is very interesting, because, as I was saying, things like the OST, it depends on how you interpret, province of mankind. And of course, the Moon Agreement uses that different language of heritage of mankind, which then has very different legal meaning. So if you've got a province, people can use it. If you've got a heritage, you're not really supposed to touch it. So there's a very big difference between using something and not being allowed to touch it or alter it in some way, and having to preserve it and save it. So even those kind of language differences have enormous differences in interpretation when it comes to asteroid mining, for example. So we have that issue. We've got other ambiguities, of course, coming up, like what is appropriation? What is national appropriation? Does that even apply to a company? That's not a nation. So yeah, like what do we do there in terms of deciding like who's going to own something? Can you own something in space? And it relates to one of our other very large ethical issues in space, which is the mitigation of remediation of space debris. Because it's that unique situation where we have absolute liability for space objects that you've launched, but is debris an object? Because once it's been blown apart, for example, and it's like, specks of paint, etc., do we really classify that legally as an object? So space junk, space debris, perhaps we can clean it up more easily than we think if we choose to interpret the liability of a space object in a different way to space debris. So again, ambiguities of language there too.
No, absolutely, and it's always interesting, in tying those together with how the legal construct occurred. It was almost implicit, or almost it was expressly stated that there was some sort of licensing regime. So in order, the state responsible was the state ostensibly who granted the license, and then my strong presumption would be that in a space mining context, it would seem very similar. Like a spacefaring nation grants a license to go ahead and launch on a certain platform. They go and they do their mining, but the other downstream consequences would then be, presumably, arguably tied to the state that licensed them in the first place. And so, it's important in so many respects to think about these things ahead of time, especially
Yep.
the ethical consequences. Like, hey, look, we can, we're really we've got time,
Yep.
not a whole lot of time, but we've got time to think through it. So,
Yeah,
um,
and I think like another consideration is if we already have it in place that you're not going to become a trillionaire by engaging in this activity, then people whose only interest is in becoming a trillionaire simply won't do it. So
right.
in regulating it in advance, it may never happen, which is interesting itself.
Indeed, indeed. Well, I will open it to questions. Folks, if you're interested in either raising your hand or placing in the chat, we're happy to. We have a few more minutes left on our time, and so I would like to go ahead and provide folks the opportunity to ask questions, if any. The presentation was so comprehensive that a lot of my questions are already answered. But we'll leave everybody with that option here for a few moments. And then also say thank you again for joining us so much from Australia, Melbourne, Australia. We know it's in the middle of the night for you,
It's about
so
1 a.m. And it gets even
yeah.
worse than that. On the weekend, I fell over and I broke my ribs. So, like,
Oh
I'm
no!
slightly struggling to breathe at the moment. I'm currently seated on the floor. Um,
Oh, I'm so sorry.
so yes, it hurts to laugh. So I'm
So
not laughing too much.
well, yeah, well, we won't make you have to talk anymore. Then with that, I noticed that we don't have anybody in the chat, so we very, very, very much thank you so much for joining us again and presenting your work. It's always great to see you, and also to see the development of your scholarship as you are engaging in the academic dialogue. So thank you so very, very much.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and we will see you next time.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye
See
bye.
ya.